The only problem is that the government will not allow taxis to innovate because of outdated taxi regulations. Today I'm going to talk with you about the Bowling Green taxis case. This was a case that was litigated by the Institute for Justice this past summer in Bowling Green, Ohio. And this case is important for two reasons. First, this case defeats many of the arguments that we hear against taxi deregulation. Second, this case shows the type of innovation that is possible in a taxi market if the government would just allow taxis to innovate. Next slide. A quick overview of today's presentation. First, I will tell you briefly just a little bit about the work that we do at the Institute for Justice. Then I will give a very quick primer on taxi regulation, talking mostly about taxi cab caps. And I will conclude by talking about the Bowling Green taxis case and what this case means for the future. The Institute for Justice is the national law firm for liberty. We help protect people's most basic constitutional rights. We litigate in 4 areas: economic liberty, free speech, property rights, and school choice. Our taxi litigation falls within the realm of economic liberty. We challenge barriers to work. And a lot of times, government barriers prevent taxi drivers from starting their own taxi businesses. We have 35 attorneys nationwide, and we only sue the government. That is very true. So let's talk a little bit about the government barriers that we often see when it comes to taxi markets. Across America, 20th century laws shut out 21st century transportation. There are so many government barriers that newcomers to the taxi industry face. I am just going to talk with you today about one of the largest barriers, which are taxi cab caps. These are laws that cap the number of taxi permits that are available in a city and thereby cap the number of taxis that are available in a city. There are only a limited number of permits available, and once the cap is satisfied, no one else can get a taxi permit. Usually they're dished out on a first-come, first-served basis, and they protect incumbents from competition. People who hold permits do not have any competition in a taxi market. These permits can sometimes be bought and sold in certain markets. In New York City, for example, the average taxi medallion can go for as much as $1 million, if you can believe that. We litigated a case in Milwaukee that involved a challenge to a taxi cap in the city of Milwaukee, and in Milwaukee, the average taxi permit was selling for $150,000. That was more than the average price of a home in Milwaukee. There are common arguments that we hear when we litigate these taxi cases from government officials against taxi deregulation. I have listed them all here. There are actually more, but I listed the most popular here. Too many taxis will lead to no taxis. Drivers won't be able to earn a decent living if too many taxis are allowed to operate. People no longer use taxis. We have ride sharing. Nobody cares about taxis anymore. Deregulation raises prices for consumers, which we all know is not true. So now we've gotten to the point where we can talk about the Bowling Green taxis case. Meet John Rinaldi. John was actually supposed to be with us today, but believe it or not, his final application was up for approval this week in Bowling Green, so he wasn't able to make it, and he wishes he could have been here. John was a longtime Ohio entrepreneur who tried many businesses in Athens, Ohio. He even had a calzone business at one time, which just didn't take off. Then he used his experience from being a student at Ohio University, and he saw a need for markets that are often a need in markets for safe and affordable rides that are often markets that are untouched by ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft. When John called our office last spring, we were frankly a little surprised to hear about a taxi controversy in Bowling Green, Ohio. We know that the taxi cab laws are bad everywhere, but we started to think that this case might be about something more than just Bowling Green, Ohio. This case was about 20th century laws shutting out 21st century transportation. I'm going to show you a quick video that will give you some background about John and Green Cab and the events that gave rise to our case.
$3 cab rides, they're life-changing. I go out, I go home, and it's always $3. Just need to call my man Mitch.
I'm Mitch with Green Cab, and we offer $3 cab rides anywhere around Ohio University. It's a great time. I'm meeting people and I'm making money. Before this, I was stocking shelves, and that's probably where I'd be if I hadn't met John.
I'm John Rinaldi. My buddy Chris and I run Green Cab here in Athens, Ohio, where we went to school. I'm not necessarily a taxi guy. I actually started as an internet entrepreneur. The service is simple. We use Toyota Priuses, and the fare is $3 anywhere on campus. We have a unique dispatching system. It connects consumers and drivers automatically in a super efficient way. We have a great group of drivers. They have their own personalities, their own quirks, and their own customers. They're people you'd like to get in a car with. When we started in Athens, it was thought there was not a need for another cab company. We created our own demand by providing reliable service. On Thursday, Fridays, and Saturday night, we have a lot of cabs on the road. We're picking people up, taking them uptown, and bringing them home safely. There's a lot of college towns out there. I'd like to see Green Cab in each and every one of them. We decided to expand to Bowling Green, Ohio, because it was a lot like Athens. That's when things got weird. So when Chris applied for our taxi permit in Bowling Green, Ohio,
That's really
he was
the
met with
application.
laughter. They literally laughed at him. It turns out Green Cab is illegal in Bowling Green. Not because they don't like our fares, our cars, or our drivers. It's just illegal to start a new taxi company. I've been in a lot of businesses, but never one where the government just said, nope, we have enough of those. It's not right. Economic freedom requires equal opportunity. So we teamed up with the Institute for Justice to protect our economic liberty and the right to give people rides. Green Cab is cool. There should be more Green Cabs out there. More room for people like me and more room for people like Mitch. Go here to make that happen.
Next slide. Thank you. So what's different about Green Cab? We just heard a lot about ride sharing and the ride sharing model. And Green Cab is a taxi business. It is not a smartphone-based business. People have to call to get a taxi ride, and they use a dispatch service. But here's what's different. All rides are $3 or $6 per person. This is a predictable fare. The taxi industry right now suffers from an information problem. When I got into my taxi, when I got here in Austin, I had no idea how much my fare was going to cost. I just hoped it would be less than $50. And thankfully it was. but the problem is that a lot of times we get into the first taxi that we see and we don't think about the brand, we don't think about the cost, we're just happy that it's there. In addition to this predictable fare, Green Cab also offered an innovative dispatch system. John had experience working in the airline industry, and he was very impressed by how the airline industry efficiently managed pilots, airplanes, and passengers. John wanted to use this experience to configure a dispatch system that would allow drivers and riders to be immediately connected. So when a customer would call Green Cab, the customer would immediately be connected to the most available driver at that moment, and and that driver would be able to tell the customer, I'm on my way. That created reliable rides that people could depend on. And it turns out that when rides are reliable, people use them. The drivers, you might have noticed that Green Cab's drivers do not look like the typical taxi driver that you see when you get into a taxi cab. Green Cab's drivers are young, they're professional, many of them have advanced degrees. There are quite a few female drivers in their 20s who you never see driving a taxi cab. They're people that you want to get into a car with. And John is able to attract these drivers because he offers competitive compensation and treats them well. This is something that we don't see in the typical taxi industry. This is something that companies that have had the ability to operate for years without competition just don't do. They lease cars to drivers at high rents, and it's hard for drivers to make money. Green Cab maintains all of the vehicles. Their drivers are independent contractors, but they simply pay a nominal fee to use the cab, and they share a small portion of their fares with John and with Green Cab, and they keep all of their tips. What's interesting is that a lot of times their tips actually exceeded the fare, so many of them made quite a bit of money driving for Green Cab. Lastly, the cabs are different. They're eco-friendly Priuses, and they have very low fuel costs, which help keep costs low for consumers. Green Cab started in Athens, Ohio. Did anyone here go to Ohio University? Jesse actually just told me, Jesse told me he has been in the car with Mitch. Which, another thing about Green Cab's drivers, they've actually achieved some sort of what they like to call taxi fame in the community because they're so popular. John happened to start a taxi business in a city that lets anyone who wants to start a taxi business simply start a taxi business. There's no cap on taxi permits in Athens, and when John started his business took off. He created a demand for taxis that didn't exist in the city. In fact, even John's competitors let him know that they were benefiting from Green Cab's presence. It was a pretty good deal for everybody because more people were using taxis than ever before. In light of his success in Athens, John wanted to do the natural thing and expand his business to another city, hopefully another college town. That's what he had planned. He did some market research and identified Bowling Green, Ohio. It was a lot like Athens, similar in population, and housed a large state university, Bowling Green State University. There also seemed to be a need for safe, reliable, and affordable taxi rides in the community. But what John didn't realize when he identified Bowling Green was that Bowling Green regulates taxis the way most cities in America do. City law capped the number of taxis at 1 taxi per 2,000 residents. This gets really bad, so bear with me. There were only 16 taxi cabs in the city of Bowling Green, but the reality was even worse. The government was using almost half of these permits to operate BG Transit, a city-run shuttle service that didn't operate on nights or weekends, when most people in the city of Bowling Green needed rides. This shuttle service operated on a pre-scheduled route, and you had to call an hour in advance to schedule a ride. The remaining permits were granted exclusively to 2 companies, neither of which also offered a taxi service. They offered share-a-ride services. So there was no real taxi service in the city of Bowling Green, yet still the city would not allow John in. When John tried to apply for his taxi permit with his buddy Chris from Ohio University, they were literally laughed out of City Hall. They told them they had enough taxis, and they told him that it would be a waste of his time and money. As an entrepreneur, John did not give up. Instead, he called the Institute for Justice, and this case to us sounded a lot like the government using its power to protect itself and certain businesses from competition at the public's expense. So we decided to take on representing John to fight for his right and the right of taxi entrepreneurs across the state of Ohio to earn an honest living. Fortunately for John Green Cab and the Bowling Green community, this case had a happy ending. We filed our lawsuit on June 3rd, 2015. Within a couple of days, the city said that the law served no apparent purpose. This is actually a quote that was in the Toledo Blade, quoting the city attorney. "It's just an old law on the books. I don't know what it's supposed to do." Music to a litigator's ears. The city repealed the taxi cap 1 month later, needless to say, and John can now bring his service to Bowling Green. This was a fortunate result for John, but unfortunately, taxi caps like these remain in place across the country. And a lot of these taxi caps serve no apparent purpose. These laws stifle innovation by preventing entrepreneurs from opening and expanding their businesses, and they reduce competition, which hurts consumers. An entrepreneur shouldn't have to hire a lawyer to simply start a taxi business. And consumers and entrepreneurs should have the right to decide how many taxis a city really needs. Green Cab's success in Athens is proof that taxi freedom is nothing to fear. Thank you.